Welcome to another Early Years Learning Hub podcast. My name is Jackie Ward and I'm the founder and managing director of the Early Years Learning Hub. This episode is one of our Unpacking theory and research series where I invite academics, researchers and experts to tell us what the theory, research or contemporary understandings mean for our day-to-day practice and our work as teachers, educators and leaders. This episode is about understanding and guiding children's behaviour, and today I am joined by Professor Cathrine Neilsen-Hewett. Cathrine has had an extensive and broad academic career in early childhood and is well known as a behaviour expert. So, Cathrine, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself and your professional journey?
Sure. Thanks, Jackie. It's so lovely to be here with you first. So I've been a early childhood academic now for 32 years. So I started my academic career at the University of Sydney, and then I moved to the wonderful Institute of Early Childhood at Macquarie University. I was there for 17 years, and that was where I was really schooled about the significance of high quality early childhood education and care for children's developmental outcomes. And more importantly, it's where I developed a very deep understanding of the significant role that educators and teachers play in the learning journeys and wellbeing journeys of young children. Back in 2014, the early start was being conceived at the University of Wollongong, and I came to the University of Wollongong as the director of the early years. And since then, I've done some really deep thinking around pre-service teacher education. And with some fabulous colleagues from Oxford University, Iram Siraj and Ted Mellish, we started really developing a quite rigorous research program around the role of professional development and the role of high-quality professional development interventions in enhancing quality practice, but more importantly, how we could ensure shifts in quality practice could translate to enhanced outcomes for children. And so really the last 10 years of my research area and also my focus on pre-service teacher education has really targeted workforce development and workforce growth. And that's been a really exciting part of what I've been doing as an academic, but also as a higher education practitioner.
That's awesome. Definitely, I've known your work in that space and done some work with you, and I think I couldn't agree more. I think, professional learning is such an important part of understanding what quality pedagogy looks like and being able to do things that, have such an influence, I think, on children's lifelong trajectories. That idea of really setting them up for success in the early years, I think, is so important. So I'm so excited to have you talking on the podcast today. And we could have had you talking on a lot of different topics, so maybe we'll have you on again at another time.
Would love to.
Awesome. Today I'm really interested to talk to you about challenging behaviours because this one comes up a lot. And I think, I think about the Australian Professional Standard, the one that talks about classroom management and all of those sorts of things, and how challenging it is as a beginning teacher to get your head around that, and how, the social media is just flooded with people asking questions about this and managing challenging behaviours. So I'm really interested to talk about it from your area of expertise. So what are challenging behaviours? What do they represent? How do teachers and educators manage them? And how does understanding behaviour support educators in dealing with them? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think if I may, I'm going to start our conversation by doing a little bit of a mindset shift or a positioning shift around how we talk about behaviours. And we often talk about challenging behaviours. And in fact, our call to action is the behaviour, right? These are big behaviours. They pose a risk for the child. They pose a risk to other children. They pose a risk to the environment and the adult. However, if we are going to respond effectively and support children, we need to move our focus away from just the behaviour in and of itself to thinking much more around the impact of that behaviour and the pathways that underpin that behaviour. So the first thing I'm going to really invite your listeners to do is to think about how they talk about behaviours. So rather than talking about challenging behaviours or indeed managing challenging, I want us to think about behaviours that challenge rather than challenging behaviours. Now, I know that sounds slightly nuanced, but what I'm suggesting is the challenge doesn't sit in the child, because when we say challenging behaviours, then the challenge sits with that child and the behaviour. But when we say behaviours that challenge, the challenge sits outside the child, and the challenge sits in the impact that behaviour has, and it becomes contextual. So sometimes a behaviour that happens in the home environment may be the same behaviour that happens in the early childhood context, but it's not challenging at home. There's no one to compete against. There's not the same rules. There's not the same restrictions. So the challenge sits in the impact that it has on the child, on other children, and on the environment. And when we shift that lens, it helps us to better understand how to respond. So when I talk about behaviours that challenge, I really encourage educators and teachers to move away from the what of children's behaviour to the why. And our first step to really ensuring effective and supportive and responsive environments is about developing a much deeper awareness of the different lenses or the different functions of children's behaviour. So I think it's really helpful to think about children's behaviour as a form of communication. So it's a way that the child communicates that things are not okay for me. I need your support. So when they're knocking that tower down, when they're kicking a ball across the room or kicking down another child's game, we need to be thinking much more deeply about what is it that they're trying to tell us. So they might be saying, I don't have the skills necessary to be able to ask someone to play. Or they might be saying, I just don't feel safe in this environment. And the behaviour is telling me something about their lack of safety and their lack of security. Or they might actually be saying, you know what, I come from a party house and there was a party last night. I didn't get dinner, didn't get breakfast. I've had no sleep. I'm tired, I'm stressed, I'm overwhelmed. Or they might actually be saying, you know what, when I want to get what I need, I engage in these big behaviours and I get exactly what I want. This behaviour's been successful previously, and so I'm going to keep repeating that behaviour. So shifting our lens to thinking much more about the roots, the function, what that behaviour is communicating, and the presence or absence of effective relationships helps us to think much more deeply around what is happening for that child. So moving away from the what of children's behaviour to thinking much more deeply about the why. Why is it happening? What do I need to do to ensure this child has the skills, or that they feel safe, that they feel secure, that their needs are being met, that they have clear understanding of the expectations in the environment? When we shift that lens, then we're much better prepared to respond in a compassionate and responsive and evidence-informed way.
Yeah, all of what you've said there so resonates with my thinking around that too. And I think when we're saying it's the child and their behaviours, then what solution is that? If like, how are you going to get to that solution? Often it's like, oh, we need to get rid of this child. I'm like, well, there could be another one coming, just around the corner if you haven't addressed the issues of what was causing that in the first place. And that idea that we, are really investing in people, that they're not disposable to say, oh, it's too hard to have you here. But yeah, and I think that, so many messages about the way adults respond to those behaviour that challenges. I was just trying to get the wording right.
I know. We have to be really intentional, right? It's because it's such a common way that it's been.
Yeah.
You've got to manage the child.
Yeah, that's right.
And it's easier to think about that. I often hear adults say, they're just triggering me. Like, he's triggering me, or the behaviour's triggering me, or, what David does there really triggers me. And I say to them, the trigger's not David, the trigger is in you.
Yes.
That behaviour is triggering something in you. And so the question then becomes, why do I have that trigger? Where does that trigger come from? And we see that in a relational context where there'll be certain colleagues who can actually step in and create the sense of safety and responsiveness that children need in those heightened moments, and other adults in that space who actually can escalate that situation even more. So 100%. Understanding what happens in that relational context is really important for responding in a supportive way.
And all of those things are so nuanced, aren't they? It's a really hard thing to be able to explain. Or if you're watching, say, both educators that you mentioned on a video, it probably would be more obvious if you were watching them side by side. But if you were just watching the, educator that was doing the high quality practices, it wouldn't be as obvious, would it? So
Yeah.
it's tricky, but yeah, I'm very interested in this. And I'm also really interested in, I know you've done heaps of work around self-regulation, and I was interested for you to share some of the key ideas that have emerged from all of your work in that space as well.
Yeah. Thanks, Jackie. It's really interesting because a lot of the work that I was telling you at the beginning, which was around those professional development interventions, which were really around the target was improving quality practice, improving those relational and intentional pedagogical techniques that educators and teachers bring to high quality practice and how that shifts outcomes. What was really interesting in a series of studies that we've done, probably around 3,000 services that we've now worked with, was the biggest barrier to engaging in high quality and effective practice were some of the big behaviours that educators were being presented with. And this has always been the case, but even more so since COVID. So we saw quite an explosion in the number of children who were presenting with behaviours that challenge following COVID. And a lot of that had to do with, stress pathways. But I think it's important to be clear that not all pathways to behaviours that challenge are trauma. There's different underlying pathways. And so I really started unpacking some of that work. And before I could do those deep dives into rich oral language and rich literacy and numeracy experiences and STEM-based experiences, I realised that I actually had to do a much deeper dive into understanding children's behaviour. And one of the biggest factors that underpins what we typically see as good behaviours within educational context are children's self-regulatory abilities. And so now self-regulation is quite complex. And if we look in the research, there's about 165 different definitions of self-regulation. But from a educational perspective, I talk about self-regulation. I like to differentiate it between your emotional and behavioural components of self-regulation and your cognitive components. So the emotional and behavioural components of self-regulation is children's ability to start doing something that they might not want to do, or stop doing something that they really want to keep doing, but they have to stop. So that ability to pack up, even though you really want to keep playing with your toys. So that kind of very active and intentional process. So, and also it involves that ability. So that's purposeful control of the behaviours and emotions, but it also involves children's ability to delay gratification long enough to think about the consequences of their actions. So, Jackie, you've got these fabulous fairy wings. I want to play with the fairy rings, but there's only one set in the early childhood service, right? Rookie error anyway. We're never only going to have one set of fairy wings for a group of 3 and 5-year-olds. But if I have that ability to delay gratification, rather than going and grabbing those wings off you, which would happen for many children, I would kind of think about the consequences. Now, if I grab those off you, you're going to get quite distressed. One of the adults in the space are going to check in with you and say, what's happened? You're going to say, Cathrine grabbed them off me. They're going to come and take them off me and get them back. So if I have that ability just to hold fast for a second and think about it, I might actually say to you, Jackie, can I have a go of those when you're finished? So it's often been described as like our internal thermostat, right? So a thermostat set at a ideal temperature, let's say it's 21 degrees, and if the outside air gets too hot, then it clicks in and it brings us back down to 21 degrees. If it gets too cold, again, the thermostat clicks in. So our emotional behavioural self-regulation is like our internal thermostat, which allows us to behave according to situational demands. So it's contextual, right? That's the part that everyone understands. Like if I ever ask educators to rate children's self-regulatory ability, they always rate it based on their behavioural self-regulation and emotional self-regulation. But there's a cognitive component. And this is the critical part. This is why we need to focus on children's self-regulation first and foremost, not only for behaviour, but also for learning. Because the cognitive component talks about children's ability to pay attention, to remember, to follow rules, to problem solve, to plan, and motivation. Like you've got to want to do the right thing in order to do the right thing. And so that's what we refer to as our executive function, and that is the least well understood. component of self-regulation, but it's related. So thinking affects emotions, emotion affects thinking. So think of those children, they're engaging in a really tricky puzzle, and then it gets too hard for them, and they upend the puzzle and they walk away because it's too hard. That is meaning their emotional regulation cannot be controlled to allow for that problem solving, as opposed to the child who goes, this is really tricky, and they stick at it. And that ability to persist in the face of challenge is probably one of the most important outcomes of self-regulation. So not only does it affect the emotional climate of the classroom, right? So the behaviours of children, it also impacts children's ability to learn. So often educators or teachers will say things like, oh, they're just ignoring me. But the reality is they don't have the attentional capacity to actually even know what you're asking them to do. So if we perceive that they're ignoring us, we're going to respond to them really differently. We're going to think that they're being naughty, that they're being obstructive, that they're being difficult, as opposed to, this child needs my support. I need to break this down. I need to make sure that there's not too many competing demands. I need to make sure that they've got eye contact with me when I ask them something. And am I asking too many things? So it changes our understanding of self-regulation. It's not only important for behaviour, it's important for learning. And there's no surprises that outside oral language, self-regulation and children's self-regulatory abilities are the strongest predictors of success in starting school, and in fact the strongest predictors of success in life.
Wow, that's really great content there. I'm a big fan also in understanding that, executive function side of self-regulation as well. And I think this is sort of like what you've just said there, reframing things and focusing on it's what I think that people need to think about first and foremost as well in terms of assessing and planning for that child. Forget about any other things. If you want them to cut, with their whatever, or use their dominant hand or whatever the other things people plan for, if those things aren't right, then that's the focus of your planning as well, because once you support that child, as you say, you set them up for success. And a sideline benefit is you minimise some of those issues that were a danger to others or yourself or whatever. So that's a really interesting perspective, and I'm really glad that you sort of pulled those two elements apart. So I'm sort of now moving back to that idea. If we're looking at changing the narrative, then the idea that we're supporting children to self-regulate and process stresses and emotions and all that, how does that in turn impact educators, or what do they need to do in response to that? What's sort of the next action for educators?
Yeah, I mean, I could talk about this for ages, but one of the things, like once I started doing that deep dive into children's self-regulation and then contextualising it within the children's behaviour, I tried to bring together that, the theory around the why and with how do we respond. And yes, we need to understand children's self-regulation because that's what they bring, but it's actually so much more than that. So I developed a framework of practice which I refer to as the 6 R's to understanding and supporting children's behaviour. And it's it's a framework that's not only designed to help educators to understand what underpins the behaviour, but also what they need to do within the educational context. And it's aligned beautifully with the principles and practices of the early years learning framework, so how they respond. So it talks about, and the 6 R's each stand for something that we need to understand, but also how we respond to behaviour. So one of the R's is absolutely the R for regulate, which is the importance of self-regulation in shaping children's behaviour. But there's other R's. The second R is the R for relationships. And this aligns really beautifully with what we talk about relational pedagogy within the early childhood context. And it really captures the importance of strong and responsive and healthy relationships where there is trust and safety and reciprocity. So again, it says to educators, if there are many children presenting with behaviours that challenge, the first thing you need to think about is what is the quality of the relationships within your learning context. And that is not only the relationships that you form with children, it's the relationships that happen amongst children, the relationships that happen amongst staff. One of the first things I do, if there's a number of children presenting with high levels of stress-related behaviours, I look at the quality of staff relationships. And that's where you always have to start in terms of that response. So it talks about relationships with staff and relationships with families. So we want relationships where there's trust, where there's safety, reciprocity, and a lot of those behaviours that we see are a result of children just not feeling safe, not feeling secure. So we've got the R for regulate and the R for relationships or relate. Then we also have the R for roots, and this is really important for educators to consider the different contexts of influence on children's behaviour. So what has come before? And certainly there are some child characteristics that we need to think about. Temperamental characteristics, there might be particular diagnostic pathways, but they're not the main pathways to behaviours that challenge. So the R for roots really gets educators to think about things that are what I call controllable or not controllable. So be aware of things like familial characteristics that we know pose a risk for children. So these are like your parent-child relationship quality, approaches to parenting, whether there's violence in the home, whether there's violence in the neighbourhood. But it also talks about pathways that sit within the early childhood education and care context. So what is the structural and process quality? Are there too many demands in the early childhood context? Is it noisy? Are there quiet spaces? Is there opportunity for child choice, child voice? So it's a framework that helps you to think about what underpins the why, but also once you understand the why, it leads directly to your response from a pedagogical lens. So we've got R for regulate, we've got R for relationships, we've got R for roots, and then we also have R for respect. And this is important. It talks about respect for the child, respect for the family, and respect for the cultural context in which children are embedded, but also the way we show respect for big emotions and helping children to understand the difference between feeling and enacting. It's okay to feel really sad. It's okay to be really angry. It's okay to be really frustrated. It's not okay to hit Jackie. It's not okay to destroy other aspects. And then the last R within that little circle that I have is the R for responses. And this talks about the pedagogies and practices that are needed within context that first make sure that these behaviours don't happen in the first place, but also pedagogies and practices that respond to children in the moment. So when children are in that hyper or hypo state, what are some of the sensory experiences? So it's really designed to help educators to understand where children are sitting in their self-regulatory brains. So are they in their survival brain? Are they sitting in their emotional brain and their amygdala's gone into hyper-control? And then if that's the case, then we actually engage in very different pedagogical practices. We engage in those beautiful breathing, the sensory experiences, our sensory toys. Or are children in their thinking brain? I call it my self-regulatory ship. So are they on their deck? And then how do we build self-regulatory muscles? So it's all those kind of things, giving them all of those pedagogic practices that help children develop attentional skills, help them to develop problem-solving skills, help them to ability to inhibit responses like your Simon Says and things like that. And so all of that sits together, which is not only the why, the diagnostic, like what's happening for this child, but it also directly relates to the pedagogies and practices. And that final R, which is my favourite R, which is what I call the R for research. And it's that idea that all of this, our understanding of self-regulation, our understanding of roots, our pedagogical practices sits within an evidence base. That how do I know the practices that I'm engaging with are going to make a difference for the children and the families that I'm working with? Because unfortunately, unintentionally, many of the practices that we engage in actually make the problem worse.
Worse, yes.
So it's really been designed to empower educators and teachers to make evidence-informed decisions, but it's not prescriptive. So it allows you to respond differently for different children across different contexts at different times for different educators and teachers. So it sits within that broader relational, responsive and contextual positioning.
I've got here a tip for the most successful way to change practice in the service, because we've talked about the idea of how effective professional learning, makes a difference. So what do you think, if anyone's listening out there going, okay, well, all of this sounds amazing, but what could I do to what would be my next step?
Yeah. From my professional learning research, and I can really draw on that. So what are the key elements for supporting practice change? And I think that is one of the biggest challenges that faces us from a professional development perspective is that translation of learnings to the practice context. And you're never going to get that translation unless you create an environment that is highly collegial, that there's moments for reflection, and is underpinned by a strong commitment to critical reflection. So any journey has to happen as a staff collective. Like, it can't be just one person coming back with excitement. It's how do you create those moments for deep collegial discussion? How do you support staff to engage in evidence-informed professional learning? Because not all professional learning is evidence-informed. And so having moments for that, having ways to assess the impact of your work. Like, how do you know what you're doing is making a difference for children? Like, what is
Yes.
your measure of impact? And that takes time. So it takes time to pause, to look at the impact, think about what is working, what is not working. So how do you assess your impact? And then what is that reflective feedback? Now, we've got beautiful critical reflection models now that sit within the early years learning framework. They are fundamental to practice change. You cannot achieve shifts in practice without engaging in true critical reflection. So what are your goals? What does your planning look like? What do the shifts in practice look like? What worked? What didn't work? How do we create those moments for critical reflection? And then what do we need to change? So that cycle of practice is so critical.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. And I want to mention too that the Early Years Learning Hub has some courses on supporting children's behaviour and helping children to self-regulate, all evidence-based as well. But one of the things that because I'm also really passionate about that idea that if someone's going to invest their time and money or whatever in professional learning, that it does lead to change. And that's one of the things that I've embedded in my courses, critical reflection provocations for everyone thinking about what they've learned and what does it mean for what they might need to change. Because I think, we want people to not just waste their time in doing a professional learning, but actually get something out of it. And the goal, I think, of always doing professional learning is practice change, isn't it? Is to improve what you do and make it better, and therefore, by extension, improve outcomes for children too.
That's right. And I think early childhood educators and teachers have the power and the potential to shift children's outcomes and to improve well-being and to improve development. I always say that the success of society lies in how we work with and support our very youngest citizens. And so the role of the early childhood educator and teacher is critical to that. And we're literally, we're doing our workforce and our children a disservice if we do not provide professional learning that is high quality and that is evidence informed. We are time poor in this sector. There are so many things that we're asked to do, and partly because what we do is so critical and so is important. So I believe it is our responsibility to make sure that when we ask educators and teachers of their time and we ask them to engage in professional learning, it has to make a difference for their practice, and it needs to make a difference for the children that they're working with.
Well, and I think you lead to a good point there. That I always say this: if you can sort of improve your relational pedagogy and your approaches to again, I'm trying to remember behaviours that challenge, then it's a win-win for you too, isn't it? And it's a win-win for your service because the day is much more pleasant. There's flow, there's rich learning happening because you've been able to support children to learn how to respond to those situations and help them to self-regulate. It's a win.
Absolutely. And this has been embedded in professional learning that I've done. And I've had participants reach out to me like 2 weeks later to say, you have completely changed my practice and you've completely changed the lens that I bring to children. And so that idea of, I don't hate Tuesdays anymore. No, right? Or
Yeah.
it gets to the end of my shift and I can't believe it's already over. So these are practices that are around creating rich learning environments, not just for children, but for adults in the spaces as well. So you have that really enjoyable engagement. And some of the work that I did around children's self-regulation, especially around the why, we did some work through Early Start during COVID for families because they were kind of juggling some complexities in children's behaviour. And I actually had a parent reach out to me about 3 weeks after we did one session. And she said, Cathrine, you've completely changed the relationship that I have with my son, because I now
Wow.
understand why he's behaving the way he is. He's not just trying to get me, or it's kind of shifted the lens to one which is much more understanding. And in fact, some say, I actually now understand why I behave the way I behave, by
Yeah.
understanding the stress on my brain and self-regulation and what's happened in my past. So that, never underestimate the value of the why, of understanding what is actually going on. It's so empowering for all of
Yeah.
us.
Yeah, definitely. Well, that brings us to the end of our episode. Is there anything else that you wanted to add or say, or before we wrap up?
I think I've already said it, but as always, it's always a shout out to the amazing work that early childhood educators and teachers do every single day, and really about recognising their worth and recognising their ongoing commitment and the impact they are having on our nation as a whole.
Yeah, I agree. It's such an important job, such a worthy, and yeah. And I do feel like in over the time that I've been in the profession, which is quite a while, we are getting more and more respect within our broader community and more of an understanding of that important role that we play. Hopefully, we get to a point where we're further up the chain in terms of professional respect, but it's definitely changing, and I think that's a great thing. But
It is
thank you
that
so
growing
much for your
recognition.
time.
Thanks.
I really appreciate it, Catherine. It was great having you on, and I'm sure there's lots of listeners going, wow, that was a great podcast. So thank you. This has been another episode of the Early Years Learning Hub podcast. Don't forget to follow us to find out when our latest episode has been published. Thanks again.